Hi everyone. So today what we're going to be talking about is site operations for VITA this year, and this is going to be a quick rundown of what was covered in the February 5th training for those of you that were not able to attend in person. So we'll run through that real quick here in this video. And so, for an agenda, the first thing that we're going to talk about today is what site operations is actually going to look like, because I'm sure you have many questions about that, especially as we've been adjusting on the fly with COVID a little bit. And then we're going to talk about how to conduct a good interview with a taxpayer. And then we're going to talk about filing state returns. And I'm going to talk about a few items in TaxSlayer that I'll also probably show you more in person before the first day that you volunteer, and that's specifically in regard to the scanned documents in the notes program, but I'll touch on them briefly here in this video. And so the big question you probably have, especially the training titled Site Operations, is what are site operations actually going to be like this year? And so in reality, they're actually going to be fairly similar to what we have done in the past with the conventional VITA model. And so what this means is that pretty much for the most part, everyone's role is going to stay fairly similar to what they've done in the past. I would say the biggest change probably is that we're not going to have a designated printer position because, as I'll talk about, the site coordinators are basically going to end up being the printer this year. And we're also probably going to add a position for someone who's going to monitor the waiting room that we're going to have clients stay in, so we're not cramming everyone all into Braddock at once. And so the major change, though, that we're going to have this year is that taxpayers are not going to be present while their return is being prepared and reviewed. And there are some reasons for this change. Number one, I'm sure you can imagine that COVID was our primary reason for making this decision, especially as the new variants have come throughout the past couple months, and we figured that it was best to just be safe and make sure that we're limiting exposure as much as possible. And we specifically designed the site operations this year so that clients only are designed to come into prolonged contact with two different volunteers to hopefully limit the spread of COVID if unfortunately someone does get COVID. And then additionally, flexibility is something we saw as a big benefit in this model because what it does is we can potentially carry returns over into the next week, meaning that a client can come back the next week and pick up their return. It doesn't all have to be finished on the exact same day. And so, from that perspective, we can be a lot more flexible with when we take returns and when we can get them back to clients. And additionally, it's more flexibility for the clients as well. And then lastly, I think it's going to be less stressful for everyone. A piece of feedback that I know I've heard in the past from volunteers is that one of the most stressful parts of VITA is actually having someone sit there while you're doing their taxes, especially at the very beginning when you're just learning the ropes. And a big benefit of this is that in a lot of ways, it's going to be a little bit more similar to what you did on the advanced exam than maybe in the past. And additionally, you're going to have a lot of support with volunteers. Each preparer is going to have a volunteer assigned to them to specifically help them. And there's only going to be 4 or 5 other volunteers assigned to that experienced individual. And so you're going to have plenty of opportunities to ask questions if you don't know what you're doing or if you're just feeling a little overwhelmed. Because the absolute last thing we want anyone to do is to go off script and decide to start doing things on their own that they're not sure about. Always ask a question if you're not sure. And I think this year it's really going to help it be less stressful overall, and you'll have even more access to help. And so you're probably also wondering now, what is the preparation process actually going to look like for a tax preparer? And so it's going to really be broken down into 9 simple steps. So first, the client is going to arrive at the greeter table, which is in the Lillis atrium. And then from there, the client is going to be directed to the client facilitator station in Braddock. And then the facilitator is going to assign them to you, the preparer. And then what you're going to do as the preparer next is you're going to interview the client, and we'll talk about how to conduct a good interview later, but that's a really important part of the process to focus on. That's definitely not just a side note to conduct a good interview. It's really important, especially this year, that we conduct a good interview with the client. And then once you've conducted an interview with the client, you're going to scan all of their documents and make notes in TaxSlayer from your interview. Additionally, we're going to have a release form and a consent form to participate in the virtual VITA program that you're also going to give the taxpayer as well at this stage. And then from there, the client is going to leave the site and you, the preparer, are going to prepare their return. And once you finish that, you're going to let the client facilitator know the return can be reviewed, and the client facilitator is going to assign your return to a reviewer. And then from there, the return is going to be reviewed, and then once it's finished being reviewed, site coordinator is going to call the client, and then the client is going to come back, review the return with the coordinator, and then we're going to file it at the end of the day. And so for those of you that have done VITA in the past, you can probably tell that this process is pretty similar to what we've done before. The biggest change is, again, that they're just not going to be there in person, and there's an extra review step placed on the end with the site coordinator their need to go over the return with client. But other than that, it's pretty similar to what we have done in the past. And so another question you probably have is, what is the room setup going to be like this year? Because we've gone back and forth about a lot of times how we're exactly going to lay this out and how to optimize both your experience as a volunteer and preparing accurate returns, and also making sure that we're keeping everyone safe as well. And so the current plan, and of course all of this is subject to change, because if we've all learned anything over the last 2 years, it's that we need to be very, very flexible and adapt as things change around us. And so the current plan is to have 2 different preparation rooms, and each room is going to have 4 to 5 preparers and an experienced preparer who is in charge of that preparation room. And specifically, one of those is going to be Braddock, and one of them is going to be a classroom. And in Braddock, there's going to be a site coordinator in there also doing reviews with clients, and a printer will also be in that room so that the site coordinator can print out the final returns. And then we're going to have 1 quality review room. Generally, we're going to have 3 to 4 reviewers, and likely there's going to be a site coordinator in there as well at the beginning. That'll probably be me. And that is going to be in a classroom. And then we're also going to have 1 waiting room. We may expand that to 2, depending on how things go in the first week or 2. We're just going to have to see and play it by ear a little bit there. But we're going to have a waiting room there for clients so that we don't have to, again, like I talked about, put everyone into Braddock while they're waiting or have them wait in the halls. We're going to try to keep them in 1 room, and so that we can, again, limit the spread of COVID and run things as efficiently as possible. And so, as you can see, that's not many people in each room, and there are a few reasons for that. Number one, obviously, it's safer with COVID if we have everyone spaced out during those prolonged periods of time. And then additionally, it's more secure for the taxpayers as well, because if there's less people in the room, that means everyone can be farther apart, and it's less likely that a confidential taxpayer data gets shared, which is also very, very important. And so moving forward here, specifically as a tax preparer, what do you need to focus on in this process? So really, as a tax preparer, there are 6 steps that you really need to focus on. So the first is that you need to wait for the client facilitator to assign you a return. And the client facilitator is going to let you know then that someone has been assigned to you, and then what you're going to do is interview the taxpayer. And while you're doing this interview, you're going to want to keep notes and put them into TaxSlayer's notes tool, because your reviewers will need these. Because one of the downsides of not having clients here in person is that the quality reviewers are going to be really, really dependent on the notes that you make. Because while we can call a client and ask them for clarification, we really would not. We would rather have you take good notes, because as we've all learned throughout past year certifications, some things you don't have a tax form for or aren't going to show up on Form 13614-C, and those are things that we need to know on the notes tool so that your quality reviewers can review your return in the most efficient and accurate manner possible. And then additionally, you're going to enter their basic information, and you're going to scan their documents at the end of that, because we don't want to physically retain any documents this year, and each preparation room is going to have a scanner in it for you. And we have both those ready. They're both very easy to use, and so that really shouldn't be too much of a hassle for you. You're going to use the Scan Documents program for that, and then additionally, as I talked about before, you're also going to give them a release form at this step. And then once the client leaves, you're going to do their return. And then once you've completed the return, you're going to let the client facilitator know that the return is complete. Another important thing that I should note here is that this here is slightly not in the exact order that it necessarily would go in real life, because the notes here kind of go along with the interview, so that's why I put it underneath it here. But you actually can't enter anything into TaxSlayer's notes tool until after you've entered their basic information and exited the return. And when I mean enter their basic information, that basically means that you've hit the federal section of the return and you finish the basic information tab in tax layer. So once you've hit that, you're going to save and exit the return, and you're going to enter your notes and then scan their documents and upload them in there. And so those steps, I think, are pretty straightforward. I fully expect in the first week or two we may have a couple hiccups with them, and that is okay because we're all learning this as we go. But we're going to try our best to keep it simple and follow these steps as much as we can. And so some of the common questions that I've been getting from individuals that I figured that I should just go over here now is how long will a return take this year? So generally we're expecting 1.5 to 2 hours for a return. Sometimes it could be less, sometimes it could be more. It's just going to depend on what the flow of returns is like, if we're at a constraint a little bit at somewhere in the process, or if it's just a complicated return. Sometimes they can just take longer. that's just the reality. And then another one is, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, do all returns need to be finished on Saturdays? My response to that is kind of. We want all returns ready for review by the end of Saturdays. And the reason for that is if everything is ready for review, those returns that we haven't had the chance to give back to the client yet, we, either myself, Joel, or Alden in particular, probably during the week, are going to be reviewing those and then having the client return at the start of next week's session. Because going back to this point, it takes a little time in the process to get to where the site coordinator is going to review the return with the client. And so it's not the end of the world if we need to spend the first hour of the next week reviewing returns with clients from the prior week. And so really what we want is we want to get as many back to them on the same day as possible, but we really need everything ready for review by the end of Saturdays so that we can do those reviews during the week and have them come back to pick up their completed return. So again, we just want everything for sure prepared by the end of the day, and we're going to get as many returns back on the same day as possible. But again, it's likely a couple might carry over into the next week. Another question I get is, what happens if we encounter an issue with a return? You encounter information, you need clarification from the taxpayer, and in the past, you just would have asked them. But we, of course, don't have them physically with us this year. And the answer to that is that we will call them. The taxpayers are going to give us their phone numbers, and so that is so we can contact them if we run into an issue. So again, if you encounter an issue, you're just going to go ahead and call them, and they'll be aware that that is what the process is going to be like. Okay, and so now we've covered the basics of site operations. We're now going to talk about interviewing, and this is something that I really wanted to emphasize this year because interviewing is incredibly important to preparing an accurate return. The analogy that I always use is that interviewing is like your GPS for preparing an accurate tax return. If you've got good GPS, you're going to get to your end destination a lot quicker than you will if your GPS is not very good, or it's unclear, or you're just not using one at all. So interviewing is absolutely essential, and we're going to talk about how to conduct a good interview. I'm going to walk you through a Form 13614-C so that you can see a little bit of how that would work. So why is it important to interview taxpayers? So as we've all learned on the exams, not all of their tax information is included on tax forms. Example of this that we'll commonly run into here is books bought from the Duck Store. I don't know about you, but the Duck Store has never sent me a tax form. But as we know, those are qualified education expenses as long as those books are used for school. But again, that wouldn't be reported, so that's something you would have to ask about in an interview. Then additionally, they may fill out Form 13614-C incorrectly or be unsure about some of their answers. And one of your jobs as the tax preparer is to make sure that all the information on that form is entered correctly and that there are no answers marked unsure. If there are any answers marked unsure, it's your job to change that to a yes or a no based on your interview with the taxpayer. And additionally, you need to ask probing questions to confirm the accuracy of information that they themselves provide, specifically on Form 13614-C, because at times clients can just make honest mistakes or fill out a form incorrectly. And then lastly, It's also a good opportunity to build rapport with the client. And one thing that is very clear to us that we've heard is that people like to know who is actually doing their tax return. It's one of the reasons why we didn't want to move to a fully virtual model this year, is that we felt like it would reduce some of that comfort that clients have. And so this is a good chance when you're interviewing the taxpayer to get to know them a little bit and build some kind of rapport with them. And it will just help you later, especially if you need to make a clarifying call to them that you guys are on good terms and you have established a good and friendly relationship. So, some of the key parts of interviewing that you should be thinking about when you're doing an interview is to greet the client and introduce yourself. I know this is very, very simple, but especially when volunteers are doing some of their first interviews and returns, they can be very nervous and just want to get into immediately talking about their tax situation. And in reality, you should greet the client and introduce yourself to, again, like I was talking about, establish some sort of rapport with the client. Because, again, while it's important that we know what we're doing with taxes and that we're doing all the returns accurately, it's also equally as important that our clients trust us and that they feel like they know who we are. And this is a great chance to do that with your client. And additionally, you need to confirm their identity and documentation. This means that, again, you need to check their ID, their taxpayer identification number proof, and the different tax documents they provided to make sure, again, that they are who they claim that they are, and so that you know that you have all of the information that you need to prepare the return. And again, you need to always be vigilant of out of scope tax topics because, again, worst case scenario is us preparing an out of scope return. We never want to have that happen. And then third, we need to verify the accuracy of Form 13614-C and ask probing / clarifying questions. And like I talked about already, no answer can be left marked as unsure. And you need to fill out the part a preparer has to fill out in the dependent section. And that's something that gets missed very commonly. I'm going to show you where that is in a little bit. But you do, in fact, need to fill that out on every single 13614-C that you do, especially because we're going to be scanning them. And so it's going to carry forward to your reviewer again. You need to make sure to fill that out. It's an easy thing to miss, but it's very important that you do it accurately. And it's very important that you hit each of these three main components of interviewing in order to have a good interview with the taxpayer and set yourself up for success when preparing the return and set your reviewers up for success as well. So, some helpful hints about interviewing that I wanted to go over. So, the first one is do not rush it. It may feel tedious, but a good interview is going to save time later. And I'll show you this in a little bit when I walk through a 13614-C, but I even pretty much just read the thing like a script when I'm interviewing a taxpayer. And yes, it can get tedious, and it's always okay to throw in a little humor here and there to lighten the mood a little bit while you're doing that, but it's very important and it's going to save time later because, for example, if you don't ask a clarifying question with the taxpayer and we find out later that information on that form is inaccurate, we may have to have the client come back, we may have to call them. It's going to be more of a mess than if you just spend the time having a good interview with them up front. Then secondly, make notes as you interview them because for some reason in TaxSlayer, you aren't allowed to use the notes functionality while you are inside the return. And so you're going to need to make notes yourself and then enter them in to TaxSlayer at the end. And your quality reviewer is relying on you to take good notes, as I talked about, because again, they're not going to have the taxpayer sitting with them. So in a lot of ways, you're their eyes and ears a little bit. As someone who has talked with the taxpayer and understands their tax situation. And so it's very important that you make those notes so that your reviewer knows what is going on with your client's tax situation. And as I talked about, there's no shame in reading a script. As I talked about, I read every line on page 2 of Form 13614-C to the client to just confirm the accuracy of all of it. And then lastly, and this is one that I think is easy to forget when you're just starting out, is look for clues on Form 13614-C that info may be missing or that it may be incorrect. So, for example, if your client is a single parent who has a child who is 4 years old, which is generally younger than a kid would be in school, and they work all day at their job, but you don't see any childcare expenses listed or they don't tell you about any of that, that may be a probing question to ask because there may be an explanation that a relative comes over and watches them, but they also may just not know that they can deduct that from their income. And so they may just not be aware that that is relevant. So that would be a scenario where you should ask, like, hey, I see that you work all day and then you have a 4-year-old kid. How do you handle your child's childcare? And they may tell you that they were paying childcare expenses and they may not have known that that was relevant to their tax situation. But you, as a certified preparer, would know that it is. And so that's where you can look for clues on the rest of the form to help you out and give you some clues as to if there is information that could be inaccurate or info that may be missing. And there are some specific items to ask about this year that we haven't had to talk about in the past, but you're going to want to ask pretty much every single taxpayer about stimulus payments received in 2021. And the reason for this is, as we all know, a lot of people got stimulus payments last year, and it is relevant to many individuals' tax situations, especially in relation to the recovery rebate credit. And so ask everyone if they did receive their stimulus payments and what amount they received. And then for all taxpayers who are eligible for the child tax credit, you should also ask them if they received advanced child tax credit payments this year because the IRS was paying out portions of that credit in advance, and that will need to be earned in tax layer as well, as I'm pretty sure everyone has already seen when they've taken the advanced exam. That is in the COVID-19 section as well, and it's going to ask you that if TaxSlayer believes that your client may have received advanced child tax credit payments. So those are 2 items you should ask taxpayers about if you believe they're going to be relevant. Specifically, I would ask every single taxpayer about stimulus payments. Like, that one is just ask every single person about them. And then for the advanced child tax credit payments, if they're eligible for the child tax credit, you should ask them if they got any of it in advance this year. And so before we move on to state returns, I'm going to walk you through a form 13614-C so that you can get a little bit of a feel for how to conduct an interview with the taxpayer and use that form correctly. Hey everyone, so we're back here, and what I'm just going to do is I'm going to walk through again what all is on form 13614-C and talk to you about how I would go about interviewing this taxpayer. And so just to start the basic walkthrough of this form, here on the first page, really what you're going to mostly see is personal information about the taxpayer, such as their name, their last name, their phone number, and their mailing address and their date of birth, stuff like that. And you're also going to see their marital status and different household information, such as individuals who may potentially be claimed as dependents. And so the client is going to fill all of this out here, except this part here in the bottom right-hand corner. And this is what I was talking about during the slides about that section that you, as preparer, that you must fill out each time. And so this is the section that you do need to complete for each individual that is going to be listed as a potential dependent here. And so that's your job on every single return, to fill out these 5 boxes right here, because again, your quality reviewer is relying on you to do a good job filling that out so they understand your thought process as you are going through the return. So moving on to the second page here, and I think that this is probably one of the most useful ones when it comes to actually interviewing the taxpayer. And so we see here, to start off the second page, there's a whole section here where basically it asks the taxpayer about all the different kind of income that they may in fact have. And additionally here, it also asks a similar number of questions and in a similar vein as the income section, except this time just in relation to expenses. And so it's going to ask for some of the potential different expenses that we may commonly see and ask them yes or no if they have it. Again, the client can mark unsure if they are unsure. Then third, it's going to ask you about life events for the client, and these also can impact their tax situation. So it's also important to go over these with the client as well. And then here in the third section of the return, it's going to ask you some additional information and questions related to the return. You'll probably notice here, if you've done the advanced exam already, that these are the same questions that show up in the basic information section of the return when you're preparing one in TaxSlayer. So this is where you're going to get that information from. And everything in this section here is optional. So when I was making this form, I left it blank because the client does in fact have the option to do that if they so choose. And so now I'm going to talk about how I would go about interviewing this taxpayer. And so the first thing I would do is I would ask them something along the lines of, can you please confirm for me that your name is John Doe and that your phone number is, I would say whatever their phone number was. And they would say, yes, that is all correct. And I would ask them, are they a US citizen? They would say yes. I would ask them what their address is. They would give me their address. And then I would ask them what their date of birth is, what their job title is. And then I would go through each of these sections right here and ask them questions such as, were they totally and permanently disabled? Or were they a full-time student? Were they legally blind? And what I'm doing here with each of these, even though I probably know the answer to them and I've never really run into a problem with them when I'm interviewing a taxpayer, is that I'm just confirming that the information on here is correct. So I'm 100% certain that we are okay to proceed with preparing the return. And then here, I would just go ahead and ask them some of these other questions here as well and get them to confirm their answers for me as well. And then again, I would ask them when we get to part 2, I would say, so I see that you marked here on your form that you are never married. Is this in fact correct? And I'm assuming they would say yes, and I would proceed on to the next section. And another important note here is even for these sections that are left blank, specifically this one, the dependent section, I always still ask about it. And so I'd ask them, so I saw in your form that you didn't say that there was anyone who lived with you in the last year other than your spouse or anyone you supported but did not live with you the last year. Is this correct? That there isn't anyone that falls in either of those two categories? And the reason why I always ask a question like that is because I want to be on the lookout for omissions of information when I'm doing an interview with a taxpayer. So that's why it's really important there to go over this section, even if it is left blank. Because again, some of these words here, like supported, the taxpayer may not know what that means. And by you asking them, it may elicit a response from them that will allow you to clear up that confusion. And maybe they do have someone that could be listed in here. And then here's where we're moving on to this section. And this is the one that can get a little tiresome to do, but it's also the most important, I think, that you do this one thoroughly. What I do here is I just work down this list and I try to make sure that I've got all the documentation that I need and that all of this information that's entered here is in fact correct. So for example here, I would say that, okay, I saw here on your intake and interview form that you marked that you have a W-2 and you had one job in the last year. And I would say something like, I can see that you provide the W-2 here, so that's great. And again, just to confirm, this is the only W-2 you received in the last year, correct? Assuming they would say yes, and I would move down. I said, I saw that you marked that you did not receive any tip income last year. Is this correct? They'd say yes. I saw that you marked that you received scholarships, and I'm assuming you received a Form 1098-T with that. Can I see that, please? And then they would show me the 1098-T. And I would just keep working down this list in that same vein, making sure that everything on here is correct and that we have all of the forms that we need to accurately prepare the return. And then for some of these here, they're going to be unsure. The taxpayer will be. And it's going to be your job to talk with them and get them to change this to a yes or a no. So for example, one that we commonly see is that people mark unsure with regard to a refund of state or local income taxes. So you'd have to ask them and figure out the circumstances around it and determine if they were in fact if their refund of state and local income taxes does need to be included in income. And so then, for example, in this taxpayer, you would have done the interview, you would have figured out that it was no. And so you, as the preparer, as you would see here, would mark no in that section of the return. And again, even for all of these that they mark no, I'm just going to work down it and ask them to confirm 100% that they in fact did not receive any of those forms of income. And then here for expenses, I'm really going to follow the exact same procedure that I would for income. So I'll ask them things like, okay, I saw that you marked you didn't receive any alimony or separate maintenance payments. Is this correct? They would say yes. And so then I would just keep working down these again. And for ones here, like we're talking about college or post secondary educational expenses, I would ask them for the form 1098T here. In our note here, going back in income that I missed, it's also important to really talk about this other income section. Basically, when you get to the bottom here, just ask them if they have any other income that you haven't talked about up in these earlier boxes here where it gives you a specific type of income, because as we all know, all income, unless it's explicitly exempt from tax, does need to be included in taxable income. So again, just go through, ask all these questions, confirm their answers, and change these answers that are unsure to yes or no based on your interview with them. And you just follow the exact same process here for the life events section as well. And then here, this functions really similarly, this last page here, to the first page of the return. I'm just going to read them off, their answers here, and ask them questions like, for example, you marked here that you wanted to donate your $3 of your refund to the presidential election campaign fund. Is that in fact correct? They would answer that yes or no, and I would make the entry in TaxSlayer accordingly. And again, while you're doing all this, make sure that you're taking notes so you can enter those into TaxSlayer's notes function so the reviewer knows what they are doing when they're actually reviewing your return. So again, interviewing here, you're just working through this form, making sure all the information is correct, and clearing up any confusion that they may have, specifically items that they mark unsure. So if you do that, you should be in good shape. So now we're going to move on to talking about state returns. Okay, so we're back to the slide deck here, and I'm just going to briefly touch on state returns. There really isn't all that much to them. They're pretty easy to do in TaxSlayer, but there is one specific thing that we need to talk about with Oregon this year that is going to be important, that you know where to go to enter it into TaxSlayer. And so a common question around state returns is, what states should I file a return with for a taxpayer? Generally, you're going to file a return for the state the taxpayer is a resident of in any states that they earn income in if they are not a resident of them. And so basically what this means is, for example, with a student, if they're an out-of-state student here at U of O and they have a job here, they're probably going to file an Oregon state return, and they're going to file a resident return in their home state. Again, this comes up a lot with students here because often they live out of state. And importantly, you're going to file a resident return for them in the state that they're an official resident of, and you're going to file a non-resident return for them in the state that they are not an official resident of, which it will give you the option to do in TaxSlayer. So a question that we get to is, how difficult are state returns? They're really not difficult at all. TaxSlayer just attaches them to the return as long as you enter the states in the state section of the return. And it is possible to have a federal refund and a tax due to a state. They don't always match up exactly. Sometimes they do, but not always. And the opposite of that is also possible, where you have federal tax due and you have a refund from the state. And so don't necessarily be concerned if those do not match up. So the thing that I wanted to talk about is the Oregon kicker credit. And so the Oregon kicker credit is basically something in Oregon where the government gives back money that the state government does not spend in the previous year. And since in 2020, Oregon had a budget surplus, meaning that they didn't spend as much tax dollars as they collected, this year, Oregon taxpayers are going to be returned that money through their state tax returns. And so this is one of the reasons why we want clients to bring their 2020 returns with them, is because we can't do this unless they bring those returns with them. But if they do bring their 2020 returns with them, we can enter information from their 2020 return to see if they qualify for the kicker credit. And the kicker can be found in the state returns section of TaxSlayer by selecting Oregon, selecting credits, selecting refundable credits, and then selecting the surplus credit parentheses kicker and entering the necessary information that you need to there in TaxSlayer. So again, state returns are not that bad. It's mostly important just to be aware of them and why you need to attach them to the end of a return. And so Now, what I'm going to do here as the final thing for this section of the video is I'm going to actually go into TaxSlayer and show you how to do a state return. But before I go and do that, one thing we did in the in-person training is we talked about TaxSlayer and how to use the Scan Documents and Notes program. And what I'm going to do instead of walking through that myself is I'm going to link 2 videos in the description that show you how to use the Scan Documents in the Notes program. And so that way I don't have to open up our full TaxSlayer program and show that. And instead you can watch some short training videos that are perfectly as good as what I would provide. So a demo of the Scan Documents and the Notes programs are going to be included in the description of this video. And I'm going to wrap up this video by showing you in TaxSlayer how to get to a state return and specifically where you go to enter Oregon kicker credit information. Okay, so I'm back here in Practice Lab to show you how easy it is to attach a state return to the end of a federal return that you complete. And this is going to be the exact same process as you'll see in TaxSlayer Pro online. Because as those of you who have already gotten access to TaxSlayer Pro have seen, it looks exactly the same as Practice Lab. And so I'm in here working on a return for a client, and now I need to go ahead and add a state return. And so you see here, I've finished up the basic info, finished up the federal section, and the health section here as well. And now it takes me to the state section right here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to click Add State Return. I'm going to choose Oregon here, Continue. Click resident, assuming that they are a resident of Oregon. And then I'm going to wait for TaxSlayer to load. Okay, and so you see in here, all of this is going to just get pulled through from your federal section of your return. But what you're going to need to do for the kicker this year is you're going to need to enter here and go into the credits section and then go down here to the refundable credits. Down here all the way at the bottom, they like to hide it in TaxSlayer, and you need to click begin here next to surplus credit, parentheses kicker. Again, fill out this information here. It's asks you, do you elect to donate your kicker to the state school fund? I've never seen anyone donate their kicker to that, but I'm sure some people do. And then it's going to ask you for information from their 2020 Oregon return. And so this is why we need them to bring their return with them if we are in fact going to prepare a application for a kicker credit for them. Because again, we need their filing status and we need a bunch of different information from their return from the previous year, both from their federal and their state returns. And you'll be able to find all of this information on their return printed on it. And so this really will not be that hard for you once you know how to navigate to it and get into it in TaxSlayer. It's really just figuring out exactly how to get there and making sure that you remember to do this. So I'm going to exit out here because I, of course, don't have any information from this taxpayer related to the previous year. So I'm just going to click Exit Return. And so now, for example, if we wanted to add another state return here, a non-resident return for a state that they earned income in, we would just select this and then say here they're a resident of Arizona. I clicked, oh, wait, yes, that is Arizona. Ooh, I was worried about my geography there for a second. Thought I was clicking the wrong state. Yeah, so I click Arizona there. We're going to click Continue. I'm going to click a non-resident return. It says you are a non-resident of Arizona if you do not maintain a permanent place to live in Arizona during the tax year. Again, as we've talked about too in relation to students, going to school is a temporary absence. It does not mean that they move their permanent place to live in Arizona during the year. So we're probably going to file a decent number of non-resident Oregon returns this year in our case. But yeah, we just click here. And again, it would just go through all the same process here that it shows in an Oregon state return. We would click exit and we would be good to go. Yeah, that's all you need to do to add state returns in TaxSlayer. And so as you can see, it's pretty simple and it's pretty easy. You just need to remember to do it. and to know whether to file a resident or a non resident return for the taxpayer. But yeah, it's pretty straightforward. And then don't forget, I'm going to put those two videos in the description of this one with relation to the notes and the scan documents feature. So be sure to go ahead and watch those. And once you've done that, you should be pretty good to go for this weekend. So thanks for watching. And again, reach out if you have any questions.